Ladies and gentlemen, delegates and representatives of the church, please extend a warm welcome to our guest, our keynote speaker, Dr. Hanna Suchocka. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't know whom I have to greet first, probably our Excellency is sitting here in the saal, and then professors, doctors, students, all friends of John Paul II, I can say, because we all belong to this group. And I am exactly very, very happy that, that today we can discuss, we can say something, we can sing on John Paul II. Especially for me coming from Poland, it's an important day because historically we had two important dates. We had two important dates yesterday. Because first of all, and this is a present of a very famous sculptor Dźwigaj here, that we remember the anniversary of the victory of Jan Sobieski in Vienna over Islam, we can say, using today's words, but it was against Turkey. And it is exactly about 400 years ago, something like that, less than 400 years ago. And then being closer to John Paul II and our history of European history, just 12th of September 1989, the first non-communist government in this part of Europe, the central part of Europe, of course, being before under the Soviet domination, was created. It was the government of Tadeusz Mazowiecki. And yesterday we celebrated this exactly very, very for us important day. And today, the day after, I came here to say something on political role of John Paul II as I decided to choose my topic. I think, and it was always my impression, and not only my impression, but my strong conviction that John Paul II exactly played a really role of political leader, not only spiritual one, not only pastoral one, but political leader. It was not so obvious, of course, in the moment of his election, and in the point of his election, but it was for many of us clearly obvious just several days later when he celebrated his first Mass. And I know it, and sometimes one can hear voices that there's such a discussion. Could we speak on political role of Pope and John Paul II, and maybe it is only our interpretation, but I think that is not only our interpretation. It was exactly also this type of pastoral activity of John Paul II who could be described as a political activity in very positive sense. And you discussed today, you had a lecture today on John Paul II since the beginning, yes, since the beginning of the day, on his life, on his teaching and family, on marriage. I think that it was the main topic of the discussion before this this meeting. But it was also, much has been written about the role that John Paul II played in changing the contemporary world. And along with widely shared general opinions about the exceptional character of this pontificate, various assessments are sometimes offered on individual detailed policies, and especially on the particular way in which the Holy See has addressed key issues in the contemporary world. Of course, it was the discussion in time of John Paul II, and we can also have this kind of discussion even today. Obviously, the diversity of opinions on these concrete topics is unavoidable. Reflecting, on one hand, different expectation of the papacy's role in the international arena, and on the other, especially, I think, in the early stage of pontificate of John Paul II, various expectations of the papacy's previous international roles. The role of Pope in the beginning, or maybe we can say after the Second World War, was very limited political role. So in the beginning of papacy of John Paul II, it was a difference of opinion of his role. In the beginning of pontificate, it was a discussion concerning how much the policy of John Paul II was a continuation of international policy of Paul VI, and how far it was a new kind of policy. I think that this discussion is always continuing, because now we have also this kind of discussion. How far the policy of Pope Francis is a new, completely new kind of policy, and how far is rooted in the policy of previous Pope. Of course, it is always a kind of continuation, because it's never such a break done in the policy of popes. But there are sometimes such elements important that they can describe the policy as a completely new one. And one, in this sense, it could agree with George Weigel, who said that the claim about a simple continuation has grown increasingly untenable with the passage of successive years of John Paul II pontificate. The major, perhaps key difference was that John Paul II not only followed the change and took part in ongoing international developments, but most importantly, was a catalyst for these developments, sometimes causing and other times anticipating or accelerating their development. At the beginning, I would like to point out several points which were a cause of some fears, or we can say anxiety, for traditional conservative Roman Curia in the activity of John Paul II. I see here such 3 points. First of all, changing perception of the Roman Curia and relation with local churches towards less centralization in any case. Then, active entrance into ecumenism, and third, inter-religious dialogue. There were exactly 3 fields of great importance, and in the beginning of pontificate, and very, very, how to say, I can say, not so strongly accepted by all members of Curia. It was clearly seen since the beginning of his pontificate that his role will be different. Right at the beginning, in a homily delivered at the solemn inauguration of his pontificate, it was the famous date, 22nd of October 1978, the Holy Father pronounced the famous words, we know it very, very well. Do not be afraid, open wide the doors for Christ. To the saving power, open the boundaries of states, economic and political systems, the vast fields of culture, civilization, and development. We are familiar with these words, but sometimes we are familiar only with the first 3 words. Do not aware, but do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. They are the first 3 words. And I think that it is important to know and clearly think on the other words. For us now, 35 years later, these words are almost a kind of slogan, so often been repeated in different situations, different occasions. They, however, do deserve deep reflection. These words contained what in secular term can be described as a highly important political program. They laid down the groundwork on which the whole concept of a new international order was later to be found. They were symbolic of the Pope's mission, although it would be wrong to confine them to the realm of symbol. It was not only symbol, it was a clear base for the international order of the future world. Each word has a weight of its own. And the sequence of the appeals is also important for political role of Pope. The first, which the contemporary world seems to forget, is to open wide the doors for Christ. Not open door to elsewhere, no, open door to the Christ. It is for moral renewal and the creation of a foundation of values. We can say that it's clearly pastoral, spiritual, but strictly connected with next phrase. And the next phrase is entry into more political situation, in referring to global arrangements. The words open the boundaries of states. It sounds now for us normal, but in the beginning, 35 years ago, yes, to say from the square, St. Peter's Square, open boundaries of states, it was exactly a shock for many. It represented a call to break the artificial division created in the aftermath of the Second World War and consolidated throughout the post-war period. At that moment, during this inaugural appearance, John Paul II spelled out his message in detail, calling for the opening of economic and political system. It was calling against the divided bloc, divided world, world divided into two different blocks. It is extremely important, even and often unnoticed in public perception, that these two spheres, the spiritual and what can be described as the political one, were so strongly accentuated from the beginning of the pontificate of John Paul II. Both were inseparably present in the Pope's international activities. The logical and deeply spiritual structure of this appeal was incredibly significant. This was the voice of a spiritual leader, because he was, in first rank, spiritual leader, who realized that the contemporary world also has needed a political commitment. In political sense, it was a sign to abandon a system in which the world was doubly closed, both spiritually closed and politically closed into two blocks. Hence the strong emphasis on the word opening. Words open, opening could be described as a key word in his activity. Sometimes we can hear that the church became open with the election of Pope Francis, but I think that we have forgotten how the church was closed before John Paul II was elected. And he made enormous effort to open the church towards the world. And Pope Francis is only on his way of continuation, making the new opening in the new world, because the world is also unchanged. But at the same time, John Paul II recognized that change requires courage, and that societies in both parts of Europe were not yet ready to make changes, not to be open enough. And I remembered very well that when we, in the eastern part of Europe, we were open enough to change our world, to do something, the western part was closed. The western part would like to live in this fortress of well-being, not to open itself to our countries. So it was the call of John Paul II was addressed to both parts of of the world. In this context, his words, "Do not be afraid," were meant as encouragement to think beyond the durability and immutability of the existing post-war alignments and alliances. And because it was such a thinking that all the agreements done after Second World War will serve forever, or almost for years. And for Pope, it was not such a thinking. We have to think on some changes and opening. This active role in changing the seemingly immutable division of the world was among the most important components of the Pope's international policy, situating him in an entirely different context. It became clear that international politics and interstate relations would be quite different than they were before John Paul II pontificate. In the last quarter of the 20th century, he managed to present a vision that the leaders of the time were unable to formulate. Because, as I said, the leaders, they prefer to live in the same agreements they done years before. One can agree that one of characteristic feature of his vision was his freedom from existing arrangements and agreements. John Paul II was not afraid of calling for solutions which seemed unfeasible to politicians confined by a web of diverse international agreements. It seems obvious that without these words, and then without other famous words, also quoting so many times, expressed during his first visit to Poland in 1979, "Let your spirit descend and renew the face of the earth, the face of this land." It was said, a land of this land. It was said exactly in Poland. Without these words, the solidarity in Poland would never born. Polish strikes from 1980, or 2 years after the election of John Paul II, and the establishment of solidarity were clear answer to these words. It was a real beginning of great changes in Europe. For the first time in post-war history, it was made a step to liquidate hegemony of the Communist Party. And for that reason, we can ask why solidarity was so important. Because solidarity was a movement who was created outside of the established system of communist organization. Political party, trade unions, they were strictly connected with kind of I can say kind of daughter of Communist Party. Yes, it was not independent trade union. And Solidarity was the first institution, first organization which tried to be independent. Of course, it could not met with success in totalitarian system, as its consequence was imposing martial law. But a first step in overpassing fears has been done. So to create solidarity, creation of solidarity was the reaction to be not afraid, to organize, to create something against the very strong communist power. His activity of John Paul II, and these words involved also fears, as I said, among high hierarchy of Roman Curia. It is well known the reaction full of anxiety of then Cardinal Casaroli, who was a Secretary of State at the period. He paid also with John Paul II visit to Warsaw. And after these words, Casaroli said to some curialists being close to him, what he would like to do to open the way to upheaval. It was such a question even in that time. For him, old, experienced diplomat of Paul VI, these words were not acceptable. And then a vision of Europe, because for us it's also important how is a vision of Europe in the thinking of John Paul II. In his first words, as we heard it, in the beginning of pontificate, even then in Poland, during his first visit, he said nothing in publicly, directly on Europe, especially on divided Europe, on destroying the division of Europe. But he mentioned it during the meeting with official of communist regime in Belvedere. It is a headquarters, it was a siege of then president of Poland, opening his speech with quotation from Paul VI. And John Paul II said, "A Poland that is prosperous and serene is also beneficial for tranquility and good collaboration among people of Europe." It was in a very delicate way said that Poland should be in Europe, should exactly be a partner for European countries. It's, of course, in that time, it's clearly expressed wish. It was a clearly expressed wish, will, desire. It was obvious that the establishment of common Europe, based on strong values, has been a central focus for John Paul II. And again, I can agree with George Weigel, who said that divided Europe focused symbolically in idea of Yalta. And Yalta was for John Paul II a central problem in his morally infused geopolitical vision. It was an event marking a conflict between two kinds of humanism, a false communist humanism and true humanism, one which should underpin the policy of the West. As a Pole, and after his election European, John Paul II had a strong sense of European identity. He had always considered himself a European, one who is deeply rooted in the whole European tradition and, of course, in the Christian tradition, which is, crucial for European tradition. This tradition was artificially broken by Europe's post-war division, thus uprooting many European nations. Hence, the strong emphasis placed by John Paul II on the need for change, which was to start here in Europe, since the division of the continent was at the core of a bipolar structure of the world, a world that settled into two hostile camps and was constructed to last forever. John Paul II thought to change this permanence as a condition for uniting what had been divided under post-war treaties. This was reflected right at the beginning in the famous theory of the continent's two lungs, later in the significance of declaring St. Cyrilius and Methodi by his letter Egregie Virtutis from December 1980 as co-patrons of Europe, and later in the context of the continent's Europeizations. It has always been obvious to John Paul II that a new European quality may only emerge from the welding of two equal parts, each offering important values to the other. There can be no talk of a simple expansion to the east. And so he always used the term Europeization of the continent. He said, in the present context of European integration, we should speak not so much about the expansion to the east, but rather about the Europeization of the entire continent. Notwithstanding the great emphasis on Europe that is found in the Holy Father's pronouncements, his vision has never been confined to Europe and could never be described as Eurocentristic. The continent only provided a point of departure, not an end in itself. And then it was clearly seen in the day before referendum for Central European countries to become member of European Union. Without a clear words of John Paul II expressed on the square, St. Peter's Square, 2003, I think that it would be difficult to vote for Polish entrance to European Union. So the role of Pope was of great importance in this new in the creation of a new united Europe. But I think that John Paul II, he paid also a special attention to the role of international community. The international community was of great interest for him also. More than the quarter century of his pontificate has left an indelible imprint on the style of international politics of John Paul II and could be called as a global presence of Holy See and John Paul II in every important international debate concentrated on human being. The dignity of the human person was central to the Pope's activity and teachings. Importantly, this is the dignity of each and every man, whatever his or her nationality, race, or belief. John Paul II leaves no doubt about that. His first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, deals with the inalienable human rights stemming from man's dignity. He represents a theory of universalism of human rights, rooted in human dignity. It was then very strongly repeated by Benedict XVI during his visit to United States. This was a key aspect of everything he did. A failure to realize this priority might sometimes lead to misunderstanding of the Holy Father's particular actions or the manner in which he handled particular issues of international significance. Those misunderstandings and false evaluation resulted from applying instruments typical of secular authorities to a description or even more difficult to an appraisal of the Holy See's activities. Failure to understand these differences often led to unjust opinions, distorting the essence of the papal commitment to particular issues. The coherent vision of the international order propagated by John Paul II was based on 4 values: peace, justice, solidarity, and mercy, the same pillars we can see now in activity of Pope Francis. In watching activity of John Paul II and reading his documents, one notices that these 4 values underpin everything he did, all his appeals to world leaders. Another factor distinguishing the activity of the papacy from secular authority was, and still is, the character of its mission. For the former, also on international level, this is a pastoral mission pursued primarily in its evangelical dimension. This determines the papacy's commitment, even if the outward means of pursuing the mission may be identical or look identical with those used by secular authorities. For example, participation in international organization, international conference, etc. The Pope's accentuated evangelizing and missionary role has been equated with his personal implementation of international policy. The Pope has transposed moral and ethical teachings into the international arena, lending it an international character. He has brought religious notions such as forgiveness, solidarity, and mercy into the language of international debates and broadened the meaning of notions already present in the language of international organization, namely peace and justice. Shot up by the pastoral mission, these words have acquired a new dimension. In the Pope's teaching, the word peace has gained new depth. Abused in the past as part of ideological warfare between the 2 opposing political systems, its meaning was restored by John Paul II. No longer as propagandistic slogan, but a notion founded on the human person, on the individual human right and human being. It has been placed in a broader transcendental dimension and have been seen as a value, not only as a political instrument. Consequently, John Paul II's struggle for peace could never be reduced to plain pacifism or enlargement in an ideological battle between various ideological tendencies, even if these temptations did exist. One example, but very significant, in connection with the Iraq war in 2003-2000 war, when proponents of a politically exploited pacifism sought to capture John Paul II's teaching and use it instrumentally in disputes with national governments. However, the differences in this approach were all too obvious. The Pope's position on that war was informed not by political views, but by humanistic considerations stemming from a deep concern for the inalienable dignity of every human being. The Pope's struggle for peace and against violence, war and terrorism intertwines with his endeavors to guarantee the fundamental right to life for each individual. And Pope had exactly a very strong impression of human rights. The personalism of John Paul II, as reflected in his constant emphasis on the importance of the human person and in treating human dignity as the point of reference for all other rights, has encountered the concept of human rights dynamically developing since the 1970s. This opened new areas for the Holy See's international activity, as well as influence in implementation. The Vatican has also shown an interest in human rights in the past, in welcoming the creation of the Council of Europe and OSCE. But John Paul II gave the issue a new impulse and mapped out its new ambitions. He also pointed out very strongly on the universalism, as I said before, on human rights. It was clearly said in his message to the Day of Peace in 1999, "Respect for human rights, the secret of true peace." He wrote, "When the promotion of the dignity of person is the guiding principle, and when the search for the common good is the overriding commitment, then solid and lasting foundations for building peace are laid." He recalled the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, saying that it acknowledged the rights which it proclaims but does not confer them, since they are inherent in the human person and human dignity. Here is a clear distinction which is strictly also discussed now between use and lex, the natural law and statutory law. It is one of the very important problem in contemporary world. On one hand, he drew attention to those rights on which the Church was previously silent, such, for example, as the right for national, ethnic, linguistic minorities. And on the other, he strongly protested the deformation of human rights, the identification of rights that contravene the dignity of human person and pose grave threats to contemporary society as such. He introduced the notion of the civilization of death to the language of international discourse. He was also a firm opponent of the death penalty, which clashed with his vision of the international order. The position on the right to life taken by Holy See and the Pope himself has a clearly international dimension. His strong commitments to preventing the elevation of so-called destructive rights to abortion, rights to euthanasia, to the status of universal standards, was grounded in these values. John Paul II's vision of the international order was founded on man's internal harmony and on harmonious relations among people. There was no room within these relations for taking life in any stage of in any form. So for that reason, he was so strongly for the right to life since the beginning, since the conception till the end, and was against abortion, against death penalty. Appropriate relations between people and generations are impossible while the right to euthanasia exists, because then how we can build the how to say, good relation between generations. In his concept of human rights, John Paul II paid particular attention to, as I said, to ethnic and religious minorities. It was, as very often in the thinking of John Paul II, it was done in the period when the minority rights became a kind of political agenda in that time. And as we remember it very well, John Paul II made a special letter for 1989. It was a message for the celebration of the World Day of Peace entitled "To Build Peace, Respect Minorities." It was done in the beginning. It was done in the 1989 because he, in his prophetic vision, he knew that probably with the new, how to say, situation in Eastern and Central Europe, we have a new situation with minorities. And it was done also after the, how to say, unrest in Basque country, in Ireland. So he knew very well that now will be time for minorities' right. But he also, in his letter, as everybody is able to open the letter and read it, he also, in very clear way, described the role of leaders of minorities. And he said that sometimes the role of leaders of minorities could be destructive for minorities. So he, how to say, pointed out the new the two problems. Problem of right of minorities, that should be taken into account in the future international order, but then also the problem of leaders of minorities that can sometimes be destructive. And I think that we can agree that the words of John Paul II were exactly very prophetic, especially in subsequent development in the Balkan countries and in the Middle East, and in tendencies in some part of Europe. And then also, I don't like to enter into details, the problem with dialogue, because he also, it was also one of the crucial words in his activity, dialogue with others, with everybody. We remembered very well how he was criticized when he decided to organize for the first time the meeting in Assisi, because it was seen as something which is not in line with a classical teaching of Catholic Church. But he decided to do it. And I had this privilege to be also in Assisi with John Paul II in winter 2002, when he decided once again to organize such a meeting after September 11, 2001. He decided that no, we should not enter into war, but we have decided to make a dialogue, organize such a new meeting in Assisi, and all diplomats were invited also to be present during this event. And I think that what is also important when we discuss on political role of John Paul II, I think it is also his, I don't like to enter into the interreligious dialogue and this issue because they are probably well known, but I am also ready to take the issue in the discussion and some questions, because I would like to open then the discussion. But I think that for John Paul II, I see here some bishops coming from this part of Europe, as we see from Kazakhstan, from other countries, from Belarus, etc. So I think that you know the problem much better than me. But for John Paul II, the big problem was always the Russian Orthodox Church and the dialogue with Russian Orthodox Church. The dialogue was rather blocked in the last 2 days of pontificate of John Paul II, after several different events, as we know, the accusation of proselytism, creation of 4 dioceses in Russia, etc., the problem of Bishop Mazur, and all the issues. But for John Paul II, the reassumption of dialogue with Moscow Patriarchate was always important goal. For him, so far as this dialogue was absent, the remnants of a closed Cold War divided world were present in Europe. It was his opinion. It was also a kind of prophetic vision, because we can observe now the different, role played by different churches and the conflict existing between Russia and Ukraine. The role of church is important, but we also know some voices, critical voices expressed by some Orthodox churches against Russian Orthodox Church. So for that reason, the dialogue with Russian Orthodox Church was one of the crucial for John Paul II. And this problem, of course, in this question, interreligious dialogue, role and role for religion, and especially the relationships between such countries like Russia and countries not being members of European Union. For Holy See, very important was always membership is in OSCE. Because OSCE makes possible to transcend the boundaries of Europe. Europe understood as European Union, thus offering a conduit for policy towards post-Soviet countries and especially Russia. A still broader dimension was assured by the presence of the United States in this organization. So it was in dimension of John Paul II, it was such thinking that it's the only place, of course, a part of United Nations, where the countries being a member of Council of Europe, of European Union, and countries who are not members of European institutions, but being on the territory of wide Europe, can meet also with participation of United States. And within, it was stressed also very clearly by Papal Nuncio to the EU when he said that within the OSCE, the Holy See plays an important role with regard to the sphere of human rights and especially the freedom of religion. And critical moment was in 2002 when successive Catholic priests were barred entry into Russia, and the problem was put in Vienna Conference in 2002 by Holy See to discuss the issue. It was the only place where the issue could be discussed. So I think that we have also, again, another word which was crucial for John Paul II when we discuss human being, human rights. It was the word solidarity. In his vision, in John Paul's vision of the international order, important role was played by solidarity. And we can now hear echo of these words in the activity of Pope Francis, who said, without solidarity, we are unable to do nothing in the world. And John Paul II said it very clearly. In 1987, it was just before collapse of Soviet system. He said it clearly in Gdańsk. Solidarity must precede the battle. What does solidarity mean? It's a mode of existence in human diversity, such as the nation, in unity, in respect for all the differences between people, meaning unity in the diversity. Solidarity also unfastens struggle, but never is it a struggle against another. They are very important words because he knew it very well that when solidarity in Poland was created in 1990, then we had a martial law in 1991. 1980, and then martial law in 1981, and he knew it very well, that using sometimes in a very ideological way the notion solidarity, it's possible to open way towards struggle, battle, tensions, and even kind of war. So the solidarity remains as a guiding principle of papacy's political role. It was set in many then documents of John Paul II, and I don't like to quote the documents because it's quite possible to enter into details in internet. But I can recall here also two points, because just I am going to the end. I had 45 minutes, somebody said me, so I control the time. And then I think that we'll have a short time, no, maybe longer time for discussion. But I also would like to recall here the very famous encyclic Laborem Exercens. Laborem Exercens was very instructive at that time, because it was encyclical which I refer to the encyclical as a Polish encyclical. Of course, it's maybe not shared, but other. But the encyclical was written on the, how to say, experience of Polish workers and the battle on trade union. The document reflected a particular experience. It had an obvious political context and could be described, as I said, Polish encyclical. Significantly, it was mentioned during the John Paul's meeting with Polish Solidarity. It was prepared especially for this meeting. And then the role of the United Nations. I think that we can also remember here, because sometimes I have such an impression that in contemporary world and in all the crises, the United Nations, it's sometimes put aside, yes, in all the discussion. And for John Paul II, it was a very important organization. Maybe because for that reason that he lived and he was educated in Poland and united in socialist Poland, communist Poland. And United Nations was seen exactly as a place when we can find agreement, we can look for a common solution. And this organization's role and the controversy which surrounds it was the subject of public discussion held, as I have mentioned, in connection with the Iraqi crisis. And United States criticism towards United Nations. And John Paul II attached great importance to the United Nations from the beginning, as I said, of his pontificate. And he spoke directly about the organization's role in his first New Year's address to the diplomatic corps, 12 January 1979. Still more significantly, the United Nations received a whole passage in the pontiff's first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, reflecting the trust and confidence that stemmed from the United Nations' special role in the protection of human rights. For John Paul II, it was important that it was a universal declaration of human rights as a, how to say, basis for United Nations. And the declaration was often seen as a kind of how to say, guarantee for natural law. And so for that reason, for John Paul II, it was so important. And, but we remember also that John Paul II, he personally had a very difficult battle with United Nations, especially in conference in Cairo in 1994. It is just 20 years ago. When administration of Clinton would like to introduce the right to abortion on demand as a universal standard. We remember the battle then, and this concept finally was not adopted, was not accepted as an international concept, but it was a personal battle of John Paul II. And I think that even though this fight was exhausting for the Pope, he did not change his opinion about the importance of United Nations. He emphatically defended the organization at its international position during all the crises, especially Iraqi crisis. And I had such an impression that he was the only who believed in the United Nations effectiveness. And then the last battle of John Paul II, it was, I started with Europe and I would like to end with Europe. It was his battle in the time of discussion for the Constitution of Europe. And John Paul II was of the opinion that when Europe would like to have its own constitution, the first European constitution, the constitution must be rooted in the European tradition and also should make a reference to Christian roots. He said in a very general way that should be done reference. He didn't call for Christian Europe, but for reference to Christian roots. Because Europe has been shaped by Christianity. And he said that denying its Christian roots means denying our own past, which only impoverished the unification process by flattering its historical perspective. But as we remember, the discussion was exactly very strong. And finally, in the text of so-called European Constitution, the Christian roots had not been mentioned. But finally, the Constitution, the text was not adopted, approved in referendum by 2 countries, and then in such situation he was not entered into force. So for that reason we can say that Pope won the battle, but probably it was not the way he would like to win. So I think that now we are not completely able to recognize the rich heritage of John Paul II, even in the political area, and it's nothing to do with such as we can hear very often now that Church would like to play a role in politics. It was a role in politics, but a role played by spiritual leader who had a vision, and his vision was, how to say, stronger, and he looked farther than other politicians. And so for that reason, his political role could be a guiding role for our other leaders and for all of us. And I think that he left us a very strong testimony, but probably we didn't till now completely not make our lesson in this area. We have to do it again and again. Thank you so much.